My name is Clara Jensen, and I'm 32 years old. I work as a freelance graphic designer, the kind of job that lets me turn emotions into color, silence into shape. I've always believed that every story can be made beautiful, until mine shattered in a single evening at a dinner table that used to feel like home. It was 3 weeks before my sister's wedding, and my parents had invited me over for what they called a small family meeting. I remember wearing a soft blue dress I knew my mother liked, the one that made me feel almost acceptable. The house smelled of rosemary and roast beef, the same comforting scent that once meant safety. But that night, even before anyone spoke, the air felt too still, too rehearsed. My father poured the wine before I sat down. My mother smiled too wide, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the napkins for the third time. Then it came. The sentence that rewrote everything I thought I knew about love, family, and belonging. "Clara," my mother said gently, "we've been thinking about the wedding photos. The photographer has a certain vision, and we feel it might be better if you weren't in them. Just to keep things cohesive, you understand." Cohesive. That was the word she chose to describe erasing me. I looked across the table at my sister Grace, the bride-to-be, dressed in soft beige like a living halo of perfection. She didn't look up. Not once. My father cleared his throat and muttered something about timing, logistics, aesthetics, words that meant nothing but sounded civilized enough to hide the cruelty underneath. I remember my hands trembling around the stem of my wine glass. My heart wasn't breaking. It was going silent, like a radio losing signal. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't about the photographer or the color palette or cohesion. It was about me, about the quiet discomfort I'd caused them my entire life just by being myself. My tattoos, my hair, my choices, my voice. At that moment, I realized they weren't excluding me from pictures. They were excluding me from the family story altogether. And I didn't fight. Not this time. I smiled, nodded, and said something polite. Something like, "I understand." But what I really meant was, "You will never see me again." That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rage or plead. Instead, I sat in my car in their driveway, watching the porch light flicker through the windshield. It felt almost cinematic, like the final frame of a movie where the protagonist finally understands she's been the ghost all along. My phone buzzed with messages from my friends asking if the dinner went well. I typed and deleted a dozen answers before settling on 3 words. It's over. Completely. Driving home, the highway lights blurred like tears I refused to shed. I kept hearing my mother's voice on repeat. It might be better if you weren't there. Better. For whom? For her? For Grace? For the fragile illusion of a perfect family she'd spent her life curating? Every memory I had suddenly looked different. The carefully posed family portraits, the Christmas cards with coordinated sweaters, the dinners where Grace's stories were celebrated while mine were politely ignored. It wasn't a single betrayal. It was the culmination of years of gentle erasure, wrapped in love and labeled as what's best for everyone. And yet, in that moment of unbearable rejection, something else stirred inside me. A quiet, dangerous kind of freedom. If they didn't want me in their picture, I would stop trying to fit into their frame. I would create my own. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. Because what happened after that dinner wasn't just a disappearance. It was a resurrection. The night my family decided I shouldn't be seen was the same night I decided to truly exist. For most of my life, I'd been the different one. Grace was the golden child, the doctor, the pride of the family. I was the artist, the wanderer, the one who made people uncomfortable at Thanksgiving because I talked about things that didn't fit into polite conversation. But even I didn't expect that my own parents, people who raised me, fed me, kissed my forehead goodnight, would find my existence inconvenient enough to edit out of their daughter's wedding. When I got home that night, I poured myself a glass of red wine and sat in silence. The city outside my apartment was alive. Sirens, laughter, the hum of distant traffic. But inside, it was just me and the echo of their decision. I looked around at the things I had built for myself. My art hanging on the walls, my half-finished design projects, the warm clutter of a life that was fully mine. And I thought, if I can create this from nothing, maybe I can create a new life too. The clock ticked past midnight as I opened my laptop. I wasn't looking at wedding venues or dresses. I was looking at apartments for rent. Not in Boston, not anywhere close to home, but somewhere that didn't carry their shadow. I didn't know exactly where I was going yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done being edited out. That was the beginning of my vanishing act. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step out of a picture that was never framed to include you. You might be wondering what happens next, how far I went, how they reacted when they realized I was truly gone, and what I found on the other side of disappearance. But to understand that, you have to follow the thread all the way through, because this isn't a story about revenge, it's about rebirth, about what happens when a woman who's been invisible her whole life finally decides to see herself. So before we go any further, if stories like this speak to something deep in you, if you've ever been made to feel small by people who were supposed to love you, please subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support us and help create more stories that remind us we're not alone in choosing ourselves. Now, before we move on to what happened next, let me ask you something simple. If your family told you not to show up at your sister's wedding because your presence didn't fit the aesthetic, what would you do? A, swallow the pain and attend anyway, just to keep the peace. B, walk away and start a new life, even if it means walking alone. Comment your answer below, A or B, and tell me why. Your story might just help someone else find their courage too. Growing up, I used to believe my family was the picture of normal. On the outside, we were everything people in our Charlottesville neighborhood admired. A manicured lawn, a tidy colonial house with blue shutters, and matching smiles in every Christmas card we sent out. My father, a financial advisor, took pride in the image we projected. Successful, respectable, quietly enviable. My mother, a former art teacher turned church volunteer, was the curator of that image. Every dinner, every conversation, every public appearance was part of a delicate choreography she directed with perfectionist precision. If you had met us then, you might have thought we were close. We attended Sunday services together, hosted barbecues in summer, and smiled for photos with that same familiar warmth that makes people think, what a lovely family. But inside that pretty frame, something was missing. I didn't notice it at first. It's hard to recognize the absence of something you've never actually had. My sister Grace and I were only 3 years apart, but she might as well have lived in another world. She was everything my parents wanted to be reflected in their mirror. Elegant, intelligent, predictable in all the right ways. Even her laugh sounded like approval. Grace learned early that compliance earned her safety. She dressed conservatively, spoke softly, and followed the unspoken rules of our household. Don't embarrass the family, don't question authority, and above all, don't stand out. I was the opposite. From the time I could hold a pencil, I was drawing on everything. The margins of my notebooks, the backs of bills, sometimes even the white walls my mother had just repainted. I loved color, mess, expression. To me, art was a language more honest than words. But in our house, honesty wasn't something to be celebrated. It was something to be managed. When I was 8, I painted a mural in my room, a chaotic swirl of blues and golds and tiny stars that I thought looked like magic. My mother walked in, took one look, and gasped like I'd committed a crime. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this wall?" she cried, as if I had ruined something sacred. My father didn't shout, but his disappointment was worse. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" he asked. Grace stood in the doorway, silent, eyes full of pity I didn't want. That night, I scrubbed the wall until my small hands bled and the stars I'd painted vanished under the weight of soap and shame. That was the moment I began to understand. In our family, beauty was allowed only if it fit within the lines my parents drew. Grace fit perfectly. She was my mother's living masterpiece, elegant, framed, and proudly displayed. I, on the other hand, was the messy sketch that never made it past the first draft. When Grace joined the church choir, I was told to attend her recitals. When I asked to take art classes, my parents signed me up for swimming lessons instead. "You'll thank us later," my mother said. "You need to learn discipline, not indulgence." Discipline in our house meant obedience. It meant silencing your instincts. It meant learning to smile through discomfort and apologize when you hadn't done anything wrong. It meant knowing that being different was dangerous. As we grew older, the differences between us became a family currency. Every time I stumbled, Grace shone brighter. Every success of hers became a quiet rebuke to my failures. When she got accepted into medical school, there was a dinner party, a toast, a new round of family photos. When I announced that I wanted to major in design, my father looked at me as though I had confessed to a mistake I'd regret forever. "Art doesn't pay bills, Clara," he said. "You're too smart to waste your life like that." He said it kindly, but kindness from him often came wrapped around control. My mother nodded, adding softly, "You'll understand when you're older." I didn't argue. I'd learned by then that resistance didn't change anything, it just made the air colder. For years, I tried to mold myself into something more acceptable. I straightened my hair, wore neutral tones, stopped wearing the bright red lipstick my mother called too loud. I worked in corporate design firms instead of pursuing the creative studio I dreamed of owning. I told myself this was compromise, not surrender. But every time I passed our family photos hanging in the hallway, Grace centered perfectly, my parents glowing with pride, I saw the truth. Compromise, in my family, meant erasing yourself until only the outline remained. It wasn't until much later that I realized how much of my life had been spent trying to fit an illusion someone else built. The illusion wasn't just about perfection, it was about control. My parents didn't want a family. They wanted a story to tell, a legacy to display. Grace was their headline. I was the footnote they hoped no one would read. Still, there were moments of tenderness that confused me. On late summer nights, my mother would sit beside me on the porch, the air heavy with honeysuckle. She'd tell me she only wanted what was best for me. "You just need direction," she'd whisper, brushing my hair away from my face. "You're too emotional. The world will eat you alive if you don't learn to blend in." I think she believed she was saving me. Maybe she was saving herself from the fear of being judged by the same world she'd tried so hard to please. My father's love came in practical forms. A new laptop when I started college, a lecture about budgeting every Christmas. He wasn't cruel, just careful. Everything about him was measured, deliberate, safe. He taught me that appearances mattered more than truth, that comfort was more valuable than confrontation. But love built on conditions is a fragile thing. The first time I broke one of those conditions, I watched it crack. That illusion of perfection carried us into adulthood. Family dinners became rehearsals for social appearances, not conversations. We talked about Grace's research at the hospital, my father's firm, my mother's charity luncheons. My work barely made it into the rotation unless it was something corporate. They didn't ask about the art shows I attended, the poems I wrote, or the small design clients I helped find their voice. My father would smile and say, "That's nice, honey," before turning to ask Grace about her next fellowship. And yet, I kept coming back. Holidays, birthdays, Sunday brunches, hoping that maybe this time I'd be seen. That maybe love could stretch wide enough to include someone who colored outside their lines. But every visit left me feeling smaller, quieter, more invisible. The family portrait never changed, only the frame grew tighter. Looking back now, I understand that our so-called perfect family was never about harmony. It was about performance. Each of us played our roles. My father, the provider, my mother, the caretaker, Grace, the prodigy, and me, the reminder of what not to be. We smiled for the camera while pretending not to notice who was being cropped out of the shot. Perfection, I've learned, isn't the absence of flaws. It's the absence of honesty. And in my family, honesty was the one sin we were never allowed to commit. That illusion would hold for years, glittering and brittle, until one day it finally shattered, over a dinner table, under soft lighting, with wine glasses half full. That was the night I realized our perfect family was nothing more than a well-lit photograph waiting to fade. The years that followed felt like being slowly erased by the people I was desperate to be seen by. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single explosion, no cruel public humiliation, no shouting match that marked a clear divide. It was smaller, quieter, like a drip of water on stone reshaping me with every drop. At first, I thought it was my fault for being too sensitive. But over time, I learned that subtle exclusion can wound deeper than open rejection, because it convinces you that maybe you deserve it. When Grace left for college, the air in our house changed. My parents' pride in her acceptance letter hung over everything, framed on the living room wall like a sacred text. Her absence was discussed in daily updates, her grades, her professors, her internships. Every phone call from her became a family event. My mother would put her on speaker so my father could listen in, smiling proudly, while I sat at the table pretending not to notice that no one asked how my own classes were going. When I mentioned the art exhibit my piece had been accepted into, my mother nodded distractedly and said, "That's nice, dear," before turning back to Grace's plans for medical school. It wasn't malicious, it was habitual. The habit of seeing one child as the standard and the other as the reminder of imperfection. That pattern followed me through every milestone. At my high school graduation, my parents were there, beaming, but only because Grace had flown in to attend. "You should thank your sister," my mother whispered as we posed for photos. "She rearranged her schedule to be here." When Grace's turn came a few years later, they hosted a dinner party for 20 guests, complete with a catered meal and a banner that read, "Congratulations, Dr. to-be." I made the invitations for them, designed by hand, hoping they'd notice how much effort I put in. My father thanked me briefly, then added, "Maybe next time you can do something a little more elegant." Moments like that came so often that they began to blend together. The time they forgot to come to my first gallery showing because Grace's mentor was visiting town. The Christmas when I gave everyone handmade gifts, small paintings, custom frames, and my mother sighed that she wished I'd just bought something useful instead. Or the time my father told a family friend that I was the creative one, still figuring things out, even though I had just signed my first contract with a design firm. It's hard to explain what those years felt like without sounding ungrateful. Because it wasn't as though I was unloved. I had a roof over my head, a family that called on holidays, parents who said, "I love you," in the careful, practiced way people do when they believe it's enough. But love that asks you to disappear to keep others comfortable isn't love. It's control dressed as care. Grace, to her credit, tried in her own quiet way to bridge the gap. When she came home on breaks, she'd visit my small apartment off campus, compliment my sketches, ask about my projects. She even once said, "I envy how free you seem." I wanted to believe she meant it. But the next morning, she was back in our parents' kitchen, helping my mother plan a charity event, seamlessly fitting into the world that had never made room for me. The thing about subtle exclusion is that it teaches you to anticipate it. You start editing yourself before anyone else does. I learned to withhold parts of my life, boyfriends they wouldn't approve of, friends with too many tattoos, art pieces that might be too provocative. I began showing them a carefully filtered version of myself, one that wouldn't spark discomfort. I told myself it was easier that way, that peace was worth the cost of authenticity. But with every act of self-censorship, I lost another piece of who I was. When I was in my 20s, I got a small tattoo on my wrist, a paintbrush surrounded by stars. It wasn't rebellious. It was symbolic, a quiet promise to myself that I wouldn't stop creating, no matter who disapproved. When I showed my mother, she winced. "Clara, why would you mark yourself like that?" she asked. "You were such a beautiful girl." My father sighed, shaking his head, and muttered, "You always have to do things the hard way." Grace said nothing, just gave me a sympathetic smile, the kind that hurts more than criticism. I told myself I didn't need their approval. I told myself I was strong. But the truth is, every act of disapproval from them left a scar. Not the kind people could see, something quieter, internal, a bruise that never fully faded. There were other moments that might sound trivial, but defined the rhythm of my life with them. The dinners where I was invited but seated at the far end of the table, away from the conversations that mattered. The family group texts I wasn't included in until Grace reminded them. The subtle pauses when I entered a room, as if my presence shifted the air just enough to remind everyone they were trying to keep things perfect. At work, I was thriving, but my family didn't ask. They saw my success as a phase, not a foundation. My mother once told me, "I just hope you'll settle down soon. Find something stable, someone respectable." I wanted to ask her if she realized that what she called stability was the very thing that made me feel invisible. I often think about how exclusion doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like politeness, like silence, like the absence of curiosity about who you've become. My parents didn't need to insult me, they simply ignored the parts of me they didn't understand. And that indifference was louder than any rejection could have been. It built inside me slowly, a quiet resentment mixed with longing. I wanted to be part of the family, but I also wanted to escape it. I wanted to belong, but only if belonging didn't mean disappearing. It was a constant internal negotiation. How much of myself am I allowed to keep before I lose them completely? Grace's world grew bigger while mine became smaller. Her successes became the family's collective pride. My achievements were mine alone, acknowledged only in passing. The contrast was exhausting. I began to dread family gatherings, the polite questions about my little projects, the way my father's smile would tighten when I mentioned my work in design. Every compliment they gave me felt like a consolation prize. By the time I turned 30, I had stopped expecting anything different. I still showed up, smiled for photos, played my part, but the space I occupied in their lives felt like the corner of a frame where light never quite reached. Looking back now, I think that's when I began to disappear, not because they pushed me out, but because I stopped trying to stand where I wasn't wanted. Subtle exclusion doesn't scream, it whispers. It tells you to be grateful for crumbs. It convinces you that invisibility is peace. For years, I mistook silence for acceptance. I thought if I stayed small enough, quiet enough, agreeable enough, I'd finally fit. But invisibility doesn't earn you love. It only teaches people how to live comfortably without you. I wish I could say I left on my own terms right then, but I didn't. It would take one final painful moment, a dinner that turned my life inside out, for me to see that the years of quiet exclusion weren't survivable anymore. They were a slow erasure. And that night, when they finally told me I didn't belong in the picture, all they really did was make visible what had been true all along. When Grace called to tell me she was engaged, I remember standing by my kitchen window in Charlottesville, watching late afternoon light filter through the trees, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Her voice sounded bright and certain in a way mine never did, and when she said, "Clara, I want you to be my bridesmaid," my chest actually tightened with relief. Maybe, after everything, this was our chance. Maybe this wedding would be the moment our family became whole again. For weeks, I let myself believe it. I imagined planning sessions filled with laughter, coffee dates to talk about dresses and flowers, the two of us finding common ground as adults. It's almost funny now how easily I slipped back into that childhood fantasy where love could be earned through good behavior and optimism. I should have known better. The first crack appeared during the engagement brunch in Richmond, a small gathering at a restaurant with floor-to-ceiling windows and waiters who moved like dancers. I arrived early, dressed carefully, neutral colors, simple jewelry, no visible tattoos. I wanted to be appropriate, to show them I could fit into Grace's polished world. But as soon as I stepped into the private room, I felt it, the unspoken hierarchy. Grace sat at the head of the table, glowing, surrounded by her fiancé, Ethan's sisters, and a handful of women who looked like they'd been pulled straight from a lifestyle magazine. Their voices were soft but sharp, layered with politeness that could cut glass. "Clara," Grace said warmly, hugging me before gesturing toward the others. "Everyone, this is my sister." There was a chorus of smiles, practiced and polite. I took my seat and noticed there was no place card with my name. Probably just an oversight, I told myself, even as the waiter poured champagne for everyone but me. The conversation flowed easily. Wedding venues, floral arrangements, honeymoon destinations. Every now and then, someone would include me with a question that wasn't really a question. "You must be so proud of your sister." Or, "You're in design, right? Maybe you could help with the invitations." But when I began to respond, the topic shifted before I could finish. I laughed along, nodding, pretending not to notice how invisible I was becoming. Ethan's sister, a blonde woman named Caroline with a voice like honey left in the sun too long, dominated the discussion. "We've decided on an outdoor ceremony," she said, her eyes flicking to Grace. "The photographer said the light at the Greenwich estate is perfect in early June." "We've decided." Not Grace, not Ethan. We. I saw Grace nod, smiling that polite, careful smile our mother had taught us. I realized then that my sister wasn't planning her own wedding. She was performing in one. When brunch ended, Caroline suggested we visit a boutique nearby to try on dresses. "We have an appointment," she announced, as if it had already been agreed upon. Grace smiled again, and I followed, because that's what I'd always done. The boutique was everything you'd expect: soft lighting, classical music, champagne flutes lined on a silver tray, 5 dresses hung in the fitting area, all shades of blush and ivory, delicate, ethereal, and sleeveless. As the consultant began distributing gowns, I hesitated. "Do you have any styles with sleeves?" I asked gently, glancing at the others. "I was just thinking about my tattoo. It might stand out in photos." Silence, the kind that doesn't last long but feels like forever. Then Caroline laughed softly, the way people do when they want to seem kind while delivering cruelty. "Oh, that's adorable," she said. I hadn't even thought about that. Grace's eyes flickered toward me, then away. "The photographer is really talented," she murmured. "He can retouch anything if needed." I tried to smile. Of course. But inside, something cold settled in. I suddenly saw the entire event for what it was. Not a celebration of love, but a production, and I was a miscast extra. A few days later, my mother called. "Clara," she said with that careful tone she used when pretending to be gentle, "we were thinking about the engagement party next weekend. Could you wear something a bit conservative? Ethan's parents are quite traditional." "Sure," I said. "Like what?" "Just maybe something long-sleeved," she added. "And no bright lipstick. You know how photographs can emphasize certain features." I laughed, but it came out wrong, too brittle. "Certain features?" Her sigh traveled across the phone line. "Don't make this difficult, sweetheart. We just want everything to be perfect for Grace." The night of the engagement party, I wore a pale gray dress that could have belonged to anyone. My hair was smoothed flat, my tattoos hidden, my smile rehearsed. Ethan's parents greeted me politely, their eyes skimming over me like I was part of the decor. My father talked business with Ethan's father. My mother hovered near Grace, adjusting the hem of her dress, her tone bright and anxious. I stood near the buffet table, sipping sparkling water, feeling like a shadow among people made of glass. But the worst moment came weeks later, when I was invited to what I thought was a simple family dinner. I should have known better. Nothing in our family was ever simple. The table was set too neatly, the good china laid out, the air heavy with expectation. My father cleared his throat after pouring wine, his voice calm, almost apologetic. "Clara," he began, "we've been discussing the schedule for the wedding day, and, well, given the time constraints and the photographer's artistic direction, we think it might be best if you're not included in the formal portraits." For a second, I didn't understand. The words didn't make sense together. My mother jumped in, her tone soft and careful. "It's just about the overall look, darling. You know, Grace and Ethan have chosen a very classic aesthetic, and your style is a bit more expressive." Expressive. I almost laughed. That was the word they chose to make exclusion sound elegant. I looked at Grace, waiting for her to speak to say no. That's ridiculous. She's my sister. But she didn't. She stared at her plate, hands clasped tightly in her lap, as though she could will herself invisible. The conversation continued without me. They discussed seating arrangements, the menu, the music, as if nothing monumental had just happened. I sat there, my body present, but my mind already drifting somewhere far away. Every sound felt distant. The clinking of cutlery, my father's low voice, the faint hum of a love song playing from the kitchen radio. When dinner ended, I stood up too quickly, mumbling something about work. My mother hugged me at the door, her perfume clinging to my hair like smoke. "Don't take it personally," she whispered. "It's just one afternoon." But it wasn't. It was every afternoon, every year, every moment leading to this one. Driving home, I didn't cry. I couldn't. The pain had gone beyond tears. It had turned into clarity. I realized that night that my family didn't see me as part of their story. I was a complication in their narrative of perfection. I was the smudge they kept trying to crop out of the picture. For years, I'd believed love meant endurance. Enduring misunderstanding, silence, rejection. But sitting in that car, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, I saw something else. A woman who had spent her entire life asking for permission to exist. And for the first time, she was done asking. That wedding didn't just break the illusion of a perfect family. It broke the illusion that I needed their approval to feel whole. And though I didn't yet know it, That dinner would become the quiet spark that ignited the rest of my life. The night after that dinner, I drove home in silence, headlights carving narrow tunnels of light through the dark Virginia backroads. It was late enough that the town was asleep, but my thoughts were loud, deafening even. Every word from that dinner replayed in my head, looping like a broken record. It might be best if you're not in the photos. My father's voice was calm, deliberate, as if he were solving a logistical issue instead of cutting me out of my own family. My mother's soft echo followed. "It's just for the aesthetic, darling." I kept hearing it over and over until it became absurd, almost surreal. There was no anger left, only clarity, the kind that comes when a truth has been waiting years to surface. When I finally reached my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the doorway, the faint glow from the street lamp spilling across the floor, and felt like I was looking at a stranger's home. My shoes clicked against the wood as I walked to the living room, every step heavy with something final. I sat on the couch and stared at the photo albums lined neatly on the shelf, albums my mother had made, years of carefully arranged images. I pulled them down one by one. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduation, every page a performance. There was Grace, centered perfectly, chin tilted just so, my parents beside her, proud, polished, complete. And then there was me, half turned, half shadowed, or sometimes not there at all. I flipped through one album from high school and realized I wasn't in the family Christmas photo that year. I had been sick that day, I remembered, with a fever that left me too weak to leave bed. "Don't worry," my mother had said gently at the time. "We'll take one next week." But they hadn't. The next photo was of Grace holding her piano trophy, my parents smiling beside her, their joy unbroken by my absence. For years, I'd believed those omissions were coincidences, oversights. Now I saw them for what they were, a pattern. I wasn't being forgotten. I was being edited out. The weight of that realization pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. I closed the album and sat there, the silence thick and suffocating. At some point I stood, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of wine. Then I opened my laptop. It wasn't an impulsive act. It was methodical, almost clinical. I typed "apartments for rent" into the search bar and stared at the results. Cities flickered across the screen like possibilities I'd never let myself consider before. New York, Portland, Austin. But then I paused at one name that stirred something in me: Seattle, Washington. I'd been there once for a design conference years ago and remembered how the city had felt alive with creativity and rain and possibility. It was far enough away to start over, far enough to be unfindable. I clicked through listings until I found it, a small studio apartment in Capitol Hill with exposed brick walls, tall windows, and a view of the water. It wasn't large, but it looked honest, real, unpretentious, the kind of space where someone could breathe. I emailed the property manager. Within an hour, she replied, "It's available starting June 1st. I stared at the date. Grace's wedding day was June 2nd. The coincidence almost made me laugh. For the next several days, I lived two lives. By day, I answered calls from my mother about bridesmaid fittings and floral arrangements, responding with polite, meaningless affirmations. By night, I packed boxes. Quietly, deliberately, as if I were removing evidence. I sold furniture I didn't love, donated clothes I'd once worn to please other people, and threw away things that no longer felt like mine. Old cards, useless trinkets, even a few framed family photos. Every object I discarded felt like shedding a layer of someone I'd been told to be. It wasn't sadness that guided me anymore. It was liberation. At work, I spoke with my supervisor about transferring to our firm's Seattle office. She smiled knowingly when I mentioned the move. "A change of scenery can do wonders," she said. I didn't tell her the truth, that it wasn't a change of scenery I needed, but an escape from erasure. Within a week, my transfer was approved. Life, it seemed, was waiting for me to choose myself. One evening, a few days before the move, I took out the last photo of my family that I still had framed. It was from Grace's college graduation. My parents stood beside her, glowing with pride, while I lingered at the edge of the frame. I remembered how the photographer had asked me to lean in a little more, and how my father had adjusted my arm to make the composition more balanced. I stared at that image for a long time before finally slipping it from its frame. Then, with steady hands, I tore it in half, not out of anger, but to make room for something new. I placed my half, the side with my face, in a drawer. The rest went into the trash. The morning before my move, my mother called again, her voice brisk but cheerful. "Don't forget the final fitting tomorrow," she said. "The tailor wants to check the hem one last time." "I'll be there," I lied. "That's my girl," she said, as if I were a child again. "I knew you'd make this easy." That night, I finished packing. My life fit neatly into a few boxes, a suitcase, and a portfolio case of my artwork. I sat on the floor, surrounded by emptiness, and realized that this was what freedom looked like. Uncomfortable, uncertain, but mine. When I woke the next morning, the world outside felt different. The air smelled cleaner, lighter. I brewed coffee, took one last look around, and texted my building manager about the move-out inspection. At noon, I received an email from the Seattle property manager with the lease agreement attached. Without hesitation, I signed it digitally, my heart steady, my hands still. I saved the confirmation and took a screenshot. That image, the lease date, the address, the timestamp, felt more powerful than any family graph I'd ever been part of. It was proof that I existed, that I had chosen myself. That evening, I sat at my desk and opened a new email draft. I typed 4 names into the recipient line: my mother, my father, Grace, and Ethan. For a long time, I stared at the blank body of the message. Then I wrote, "I understood the message. If I don't belong in your photos, I don't belong in your lives. I've made that easier for all of us. I've moved away, wishing you the cohesive, perfect day you always wanted. Clara." I attached the screenshot of the lease and pressed send. Then I blocked their numbers, one by one, before I could change my mind. The silence that followed was enormous, but it wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. That night, I packed the last of my things into my car. As I closed the trunk, I looked up at the dark sky above Charlottesville, wondering how many years I had spent trying to belong to people who had never truly seen me. My entire life had been built around earning approval from people whose love was conditional. But standing there, alone and unafraid, I realized something simple. Belonging built on performance isn't belonging. It's imprisonment. I drove through the night, passing quiet towns and endless highways. Every mile between me and Virginia felt like a breath I hadn't taken in years. By the time the sun began to rise somewhere over the Appalachian hills, painting the horizon in soft gold, I felt lighter. The woman who had left home was not the same one driving west. Somewhere between the past and the new morning, I understood that I wasn't disappearing at all. I was finally showing up. As myself, fully and without apology. When I first arrived in Seattle, I had only what fit into my small hatchback: a suitcase, 2 boxes of art supplies, my laptop, and a heart that felt both terrified and newly unburdened. I didn't know a single person there. I didn't know which grocery store would become mine, which cafe would remember my order, or what my life would look like in 6 months. But I knew one thing: I would build it with intention. For once, I wasn't living to meet expectations or soothe someone else's discomfort. This time, I would decide what stayed, what left, and who I became. The apartment in Capitol Hill was smaller than the photos had promised, but sunlight poured through the tall windows each morning, warming the brick walls to a copper glow. I set my mattress on the floor, unfolded a thrifted table that wobbled slightly, and made coffee using the single mug I'd kept from my old life, a chipped one from an art festival back in Virginia. For the first few days, I didn't even have Wi-Fi. I sat on the floor sketching, the sound of rain tapping against the glass. The city felt both enormous and forgiving. I had always lived in places that demanded conformity. Seattle didn't seem to care who I was, and that anonymity was its first gift. The first week was practical survival, setting up utilities, learning the bus system, figuring out where to buy cheap furniture. But even the small routines felt sacred because they were mine. Each decision, what lamp to buy, where to hang my artwork, was a declaration of ownership over my own existence. I didn't realize how much of my life had been made up of compromises until there were none left to make. My new job at the design firm started 2 weeks after I arrived. The Seattle branch was smaller than Boston's, less hierarchical, and surprisingly warm. My new manager, a woman named Danielle, greeted me on my first day with an easy smile and a mug of tea. "Welcome to your next chapter," she said simply. Her words struck deeper than she could have known. The office buzzed with creative energy. Walls filled with sketches, post-it notes, ideas scrawled in bright marker. There was no pretense here, no sterile professionalism to hide behind. I found myself speaking more freely, sharing opinions I would have swallowed in meetings back home. And people listened. Really listened. After work, I began exploring the city one evening at a time. Some nights, I walked along the waterfront, the air heavy with salt and rain. Other nights, I sat in small cafes in Capitol Hill, sketching the strangers who came and went. I met people slowly, through work, through chance. There was Olivia, a ceramic artist, who lived in the apartment across from mine. We met when one of her clay bowls rolled into the hallway and shattered at my feet. She laughed, sweeping up the pieces, and later knocked on my door with a new one as a peace offering. There was Kai, a street musician who played violin near Pike Place Market. I used to stop and listen before work until one day he looked up, grinned, and said, "You always look like you're trying not to cry when I play." It wasn't true, but somehow it was. I told him his music reminded me that feeling deeply wasn't a flaw. We started sharing morning coffee after his sets, talking about art, fear, and the strange ways people rebuild themselves. Slowly, the ache in my chest began to loosen. I still thought about my family, of course, especially Grace. There were nights when I'd see sisters laughing in the park or walking arm in arm, and something sharp would twist inside me. But those moments passed more quickly with time. I began to understand that grief doesn't always mean missing someone. Sometimes it means accepting they're not meant to walk beside you anymore. I started therapy 3 months into my new life. Not because I was broken, but because I didn't want to carry the same unspoken weight into this next chapter. My therapist, a quiet woman named Dr. Wilson, had a face that looked like she'd seen it all and still believed in healing. During our first session, she asked me what brought me there. I told her the truth. I'm learning how to exist without apologizing for it. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. We talked about the ways silence can wound, how I'd spent years translating conditional love into self-blame. You learn to equate visibility with danger, she said once. But visibility isn't the problem. The problem is that you were surrounded by people who feared what they couldn't control. In those sessions, I began to reclaim the parts of myself that had been edited out. My tattoos no longer felt like rebellion. They were reclamations, small pieces of autobiography written on my skin. My artwork changed too. It became bolder, more honest. One evening, I stayed up until 3 a.m. painting a large canvas I titled Inheritance. It wasn't a family portrait exactly, but a blur of faces, familiar shapes dissolving into color, fading until they vanished into white. It was the first piece that felt like closure. Outside therapy, life kept unfolding. I joined an art collective downtown where local artists collaborated on community murals. Standing on scaffolding under open sky, paint on my hands, I felt alive in a way I hadn't since childhood. There was something healing about contributing to something larger than myself, beauty that wasn't curated for approval, but shared freely. Money was tight for a while. Freelance work trickled in between my firm projects, and I learned to stretch every paycheck. But hardship in Seattle felt different than back home. In Charlottesville, financial struggle was a source of shame. Here, it was almost expected, part of the messy tapestry of creative living. Every small victory, buying a secondhand couch, getting my first local client, felt monumental. I wasn't chasing perfection anymore. I was building a life that fit. 6 months after I arrived, Olivia invited me to a gallery opening featuring local women artists. I almost didn't go. Crowds still made me anxious, and a small part of me feared bumping into echoes of my past. But she insisted, and so I went. The space was bright and alive with conversation, filled with the scent of paint and wine. I remember standing in front of a photograph, an image of a young woman underwater, eyes open, arms outstretched. The caption read, "She stopped fighting the current and found she could float." I stared at it for a long time, realizing that's exactly what I had done. I had stopped fighting for a place in someone else's story and learned to drift into my own. That night, walking home in the soft Seattle rain, I passed a mirror in a shop window and barely recognized the woman reflected back. She looked calm, not untouched by pain, but no longer defined by it. Her shoulders were straight, her eyes steady. I smiled at her, a small, knowing smile, and kept walking. Rebuilding my life wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about reimagining what a life could look like without the constant weight of needing to be accepted. Every friendship I formed, every quiet morning I spent sketching near the sound, every moment of stillness reminded me that peace doesn't come from being seen. It comes from seeing yourself clearly. A year earlier, my parents' house had felt like a museum, every inch curated to preserve an image. My Seattle apartment, by contrast, was full of imperfections. Paint smudges on the walls, mismatched furniture, canvases stacked in corners. But it pulsed with warmth and authenticity. It was the first place I'd ever lived that felt like home. Sometimes I still dream of that night, the dinner, the words that exiled me. But when I wake, the feeling isn't anger anymore, it's gratitude. Because if they hadn't asked me to step out of the picture, I might never have learned how to frame my own life. Seattle didn't just give me a new city, it gave me back to myself. And for the first time in 32 years, that was enough. Healing didn't arrive in a single moment. It didn't happen one morning with sunlight spilling through the windows and everything suddenly making sense. It came slowly, in quiet increments, disguised as small choices. A morning walk instead of another hour in bed, a phone left unanswered, a dinner shared with someone new instead of another night replaying the past. It was less like a revelation and more like thawing after a long, bitter winter. In those first months after settling into Seattle, I thought healing meant distance. I believed that if I moved far enough, stayed busy enough, filled my life with enough new people, I could escape the pain. But distance only silences the noise. It doesn't erase the echo. The voices of my family, my mother's carefully measured affection, my father's calm disapproval, Grace's silence, lingered in my head long after I left them behind. They followed me into quiet moments, like ghosts that refused to rest. Therapy with Dr. Wilson helped me understand that I wasn't just grieving my family. I was grieving the version of myself that had been built to please them. You learn to equate love with conformity, she told me once. But real love has nothing to do with fitting in. It's about being seen. Those words stayed with me. I began to realize that I had spent my whole life performing, trying to be a daughter worth keeping, a sister worth being proud of. Now, for the first time, I wanted to learn what it meant to exist without performing at all. Seattle gave me room for that learning. The city's rhythm, its rain, its stillness, its understated beauty, seemed to move at the same pace as my healing. I spent weekends walking along the waterfront, sketchbook in hand, drawing people in motion. Mothers with strollers, older couples sharing coffee, friends laughing so loudly they startled seagulls into flight. Every face I sketched became a small reminder that belonging didn't have to be inherited. It could be created, chosen, and built from the ground up. That realization began to take shape in the people who slowly became my circle. Olivia, the ceramic artist from across the hall, was one of the first. She had a laugh that filled every corner of a room and an ease that came from not needing to impress anyone. We began having Sunday breakfast together. Black coffee, pancakes, and long talks about art, loneliness, and how women our age were taught to shrink themselves for approval. She never asked about my past, but somehow she understood it. When I told her, months later, that I'd left my family behind, she just nodded. "Good," she said softly. "Some families love conditionally. You don't owe them your peace." Through Olivia, I met others, a network of artists, musicians, and dreamers who lived without apology. We called ourselves the Misfits, not out of bitterness, but out of pride. We supported one another in ways that felt unconditional. If someone sold a painting, we all celebrated. If someone was struggling to pay rent, we pooled what we could. There was no competition, no performance, just quiet, consistent care. It was in that community that I began to understand what family could look like when it wasn't defined by blood. There were still setbacks. Grief doesn't leave politely. It returns uninvited. Sometimes on quiet nights, I'd scroll through social media and find a photo of Grace and Ethan, their smiling faces, the gleam of a baby announcement or anniversary dinner. My chest would tighten, not out of envy, but out of longing for the idea of connection I'd always imagined we'd have. For a long time, I couldn't bring myself to delete her from my thoughts, even though I'd blocked her from everything else. One afternoon, about 8 months after I moved, a package arrived at my apartment. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, with handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a knitted scarf the color of sunrise and a short note. Clara, I respect your decision. I hope Seattle is kind to you. Love, Aunt Linda, my father's sister. The one everyone whispered about, but never invited to holidays because she'd left home at 20 and gone her own way. I hadn't spoken to her in years. The scarf smelled faintly of lavender and clay. Her note ended with, "If you ever need family without judgment, you know where to find me." I sat on my floor, holding that scarf, realizing she was the first person from my bloodline who had offered love without conditions. A few weeks later, another message came, this time in my inbox, bypassing the filters I'd set. The subject line read simply, "From Grace." I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity won. Her words were brief, tentative. "I know you don't want contact, but I'm sorry. I should have said something that night. I was scared. I hope you're safe." I read it 3 times, searching for the sister I used to know between the lines. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger, just an aching sadness. I didn't respond, not then. Healing, I'd learned, sometimes means letting silence stand where words once failed. As months turned into a year, my life began to root itself more deeply. The art collective I joined asked me to co-lead a youth workshop for girls interested in design. Watching them create, fearless, messy, uninhibited, was like witnessing the version of myself that had once been scrubbed away. One girl, barely 12, painted a mural of women with wings stretching beyond the edges of the canvas. When I asked her what it meant, she said, "It's about how big we're allowed to be." I nearly cried. That summer, the collective held an exhibition titled Chosen Family. Each artist contributed a piece that reflected what belonging meant to them. I submitted a painting, a collection of hands, all different sizes and colors, reaching toward one another but not touching. The background was dark, but each hand glowed faintly, their light blending into a shared horizon. During the opening night, Olivia squeezed my arm and whispered, "You made us look like hope." It was the first time I felt what pride could be when it wasn't tangled with approval. Healing also meant forgiveness, though not in the way I'd been taught. Forgiveness, I discovered, isn't about absolving others. It's about freeing yourself from their power over your story. I didn't need my parents to understand why I left. I didn't need Grace to undo her silence. What I needed was to stop defining myself by their inability to see me. Forgiveness became a quiet act of reclamation, a way of saying, "You no longer decide who I am." On the anniversary of my move, I went to the pier overlooking Puget Sound at sunrise. The city was just beginning to wake, its skyline softened by mist. I thought about my old life, about the girl who'd driven away from Virginia in the middle of the night, terrified and determined. I thought about how far she'd come. I pulled Aunt Linda's scarf tighter around my neck and whispered a thank you to the pain that pushed me, to the people who found me, and to the self that refused to stay invisible. When I looked at the water that morning, I realized that family, as I understood it now, wasn't about shared DNA. It was about shared truth. It was the people who stood beside you, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It was laughter echoing in a tiny apartment. It was a scarf sent across the country. It was the art, the meals, the small acts of love that asked for nothing in return. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to belong to anyone. Because I already did, to myself. And that, I finally understood, was the beginning and the end of true family. It's strange how healing doesn't end with triumph. It ends in stillness, the kind that feels almost too quiet after years of noise. The chaos of leaving, the heartbreak of realizing you'll never fit where you once begged to belong, the loneliness of starting over, those fade. What remains is something steadier, a quiet, almost imperceptible peace that hums beneath your days. That's where I live now. Not in a perfect life, but in an honest one. 2 years have passed since I left Virginia. Sometimes, when I tell new friends about my family, I speak of them as though they belong to another lifetime, because in many ways, they do. The old version of me, the girl who sought validation through silence, is gone. The woman who replaced her knows that love without acceptance is a wound that never closes. I used to think choosing myself meant losing everyone else, but I've learned that it means finding the people who can love you as you are, without conditions or edits. Seattle has a way of teaching you resilience through its weather. It rains most days, and at first, I thought I'd never get used to it. But after a while, I realized that the rain softens everything. It slows you down, forces you to listen. On those gray mornings, walking to the bus with a cup of coffee in hand, I find comfort in the drizzle, as if the city itself understands what renewal feels like. My life here is simple but full, small joys strung together like beads on a thread. Morning coffee with Olivia, late-night drawing sessions, laughter echoing through the art studio. There's no grand narrative to prove, no portrait to perfect. There's just living in all its uncurated truth. Sometimes I still hear my mother's voice in my head, soft and polished, telling me, "Clara, you could be so much more if you just tried to fit in." For a long time, I believed her. I thought my rough edges were flaws, something to sand down until I became palatable. Now I understand that those edges are what make me real. Perfection is sterile. Authenticity is alive. Every scar, every mistake, every choice that led me here, they're brushstrokes on the same canvas. The art isn't beautiful because it's flawless. It's beautiful because it's true. A few months ago, I met Grace again. It wasn't planned. She had reached out through Aunt Linda, asking if we could meet halfway in Indianapolis. My first instinct was hesitation, but something inside me whispered that it was time. We met at a small cafe downtown on a cold Saturday morning. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. Not because she looked different. She still had that polished composure, but because the light in her eyes had changed. It was softer, humbler. We talked for hours, at first circling around safe topics, her medical practice, my work, the weather, the city. Then, slowly, the conversation deepened. She told me she had started therapy, too. "It's strange," she said, stirring her coffee, "how you can live your whole life trying to meet expectations that were never yours to begin with." Her voice trembled when she said she was sorry for her silence, for the moments she chose comfort over courage. For years, I'd imagined that apology. I'd rehearsed my response. But when it finally came, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt compassion. "I understand," I told her. "We both did what we had to do to survive." And it was true. We were two women raised in the same system, each learning to breathe differently within its walls. We sat there, hands wrapped around coffee cups, two sisters with shared blood and separate scars. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no cinematic hug that erased the past, but there was understanding. And that, I realized, was enough. After we parted ways, she sent me a short email a few weeks later. She and Ethan were expecting their first child. "I want to raise this baby differently," she wrote, "to teach them that love isn't earned through obedience." I cried when I read that. Not because it healed the past, but because it meant something I never thought possible, that the cycle could end, that maybe the next generation in our family would learn love without conditions. That night, I sat by my apartment window, watching the city lights flicker in the rain. I thought about how far I'd come, how the act of choosing myself had rippled outward in ways I could never have predicted. When I left Virginia, I thought I was running away. Now I see that I was running toward something, toward truth, toward freedom, toward myself. Choosing yourself isn't an act of selfishness. It's an act of reclamation. It's saying, "I deserve to exist without apology." It's refusing to shrink so others can stay comfortable. It's acknowledging that sometimes love must be lost for self-respect to survive. It's terrifying, yes, but it's also the most honest thing you'll ever do. In therapy, Dr. Wilson once asked me what I wanted my life to stand for. I told her I wanted to create things that remind people they're not alone in their pain. She smiled. "Then you already have," she said. "You created yourself." I didn't understand it fully then, but I do now. The greatest creation any of us will ever make isn't the art we produce, the career we build, or even the relationships we nurture. It's the self we choose to become after everything has fallen apart. When people ask if I regret disappearing, my answer is complicated. I regret the necessity of it, the pain that forced my hand. But I don't regret what came after. I don't regret waking up every morning in a city that feels like mine, surrounded by people who see me as I am. I don't regret the long nights spent crying or the quiet mornings that followed. Because every bit of it taught me that love is not about deserving, It's about choosing. And the first person you must choose is yourself. Sometimes, I still dream of home. Not the house in Charlottesville, but the version of home I once hoped to find within my family. The kind built on understanding, not appearances. Maybe one day, Grace and I will build a small piece of that between us. Maybe not. Either way, I've learned that home can be something you create wherever truth lives. For me, that truth is here, in the laughter echoing through my apartment walls, in the art that reflects my heart, in the quiet moments when I feel whole without needing anyone else to confirm it. The power of choosing yourself isn't in the act itself, it's in everything that unfolds after. It's in the stillness that follows chaos, in the relationships that bloom once you stop begging for love, in the peace that comes from realizing you were never unworthy, you were just surrounded by people who couldn't see your worth. If someone watching this has ever felt invisible in their own family, I want you to know something. Disappearing isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's a beginning. The life you deserve might not wait for you to be accepted. It might begin the moment you stop asking for permission to exist. So to anyone standing at the edge of that decision, terrified but ready, step forward. The world beyond approval is vast and luminous. And one day, you'll look back and realize that the moment you thought was the end of everything was actually the start of becoming who you were always meant to be. Clara's story began with silence. Years of shrinking herself to fit into the picture-perfect frame of a family that prized appearances over authenticity. She was the daughter who asked too many questions, the sister who didn't match the aesthetic, the woman who loved deeply but was loved conditionally. When her parents told her not to appear in her sister's wedding photos, it wasn't just an exclusion. It was confirmation of what she had always felt. She had never truly belonged in their version of love. But what they meant to erase became the beginning of her rebirth. Clara chose to disappear, not out of anger, but out of survival. She left behind the polished halls of Charlottesville for the rain-streaked skies of Seattle. And in doing so, she found the one person she had been searching for all along, herself. Through solitude, art, therapy, and unexpected friendships, she learned that belonging doesn't require permission. It's something we build through truth, not compliance. Healing wasn't about forgetting her family. It was about forgiving herself for years of staying small. By choosing herself, Clara didn't abandon love. She redefined it. Her story reminds us that sometimes freedom is born from loss, and that walking away from the wrong people creates space for the right ones to find us. The lesson is simple yet profound. Choosing yourself is not selfish. It's essential. It's about honoring your truth even when it costs you comfort, learning that peace is not the absence of pain but the presence of authenticity. If you've ever felt unseen or unloved for who you truly are, remember, you have the power to rewrite your story. Now let's reflect. If you were in Clara's position, what would you have done? A, stay to keep the peace, hoping things would change. B, leave and start over, even if it meant being alone. Comment your answer, A or B, below. And what about you? Do you believe choosing yourself can coexist with loving others? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can learn from one another. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories that heal, empower, and remind you that your truth is worth living for.